All right, I suppose we can expect some people to start rolling in the middle of this talk. It's my great pleasure today to welcome back to Washington University Sarah Robbins, who got her PhD here in 2012, working in the philosophy, neuroscience, psychology program. She did a dissertation at that time on the memory trace, asking the question whether the memory trace should be understood at the personal or the subpersonal level. And she told me the other day that this question continues to animate much of her work, I'm happy to say. She's published articles in numerous philosophy of science journals and is increasingly having an impact on scientific discussions about the nature of memory and what the biological foundations of memory must be. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome back Sarah Robbins from Kansas University, who will give us a talk called Stable Engrams and Neural Dynamics, the Need for Neurophilosophy.
Thanks for coming out so early, and thanks for having me. I think I said this to a few people yesterday, but there should be some sort of word for the emotion that is the coming back to your place where you got your PhD to give a talk. There's the sort of that has a particular feeling to it. So it's a lot of nostalgia and sentiment, and also a particular reinstatement of graduate school anxiety, which is a fun. So thank you for that, Joe. But it really is great to be here, and it was great to hear everything yesterday. It was a very so that was a very exciting day for me. It let me think about a couple of things in different ways, in part because what I was already planning to say was that I think I'm coming at the question of cognitive ontology a bit sideways in a lot of ways. Yesterday, hearing all the talks and discussions really helped me to think about exactly what it is I'm doing in relationship to that, and what kinds of intersections I might make and what I have to say. But that said, that had me thinking and trying to update some slides last night and this morning, so I'm going to hope there's still a coherent thread to tell. So bear with me if the structure breaks down in a couple of ways, just based on the fact that it's early in the morning. So one thing that might be puzzling you for a couple of different reasons is the fact that I'm using this word neurophilosophy. So this could be puzzling you because this isn't the kind of chosen interdisciplinary mind-brain term of jargon that this workshop is supposed to be about. And if you're a philosopher, it might, especially a philosopher of neuroscience, it might kind of puzzle you because this isn't a term we use anymore. This is sort of unpopular and brings with it a lot of connotations that I'll say something about. But I think there's actually, I'm intentionally using it, and I think there might be a reason to bring this term back. And so this is actually, I've been thinking about the ways in which a certain way of understanding what neurophilosophy is can kind of inform and frame the kinds of things that I think about with regards to the nature of memory. And when I was preparing to come here and for yesterday, I was sort of thinking about the connections between why I think about this and projects in cognitive ontology. So that's what I'm going to try to say something about. So I'll say a little bit about neurophilosophy first and how I want to understand this. And this is a kind of new idea of mine to push on this in this way, so I'll be especially curious about what you all have to say about that. So the term neurophilosophy is most strongly associated with Patricia Churchill in her mid-1980s book, which is sort of this, in one sense, very straightforward and innocent and simple attempt, that the aim was simply to introduce philosophy and neuroscience to one another. So the book is sort of half of one, half of the other, kind of telling of the history of neuroscience and a telling of the history of most of the 20th century philosophy of science, right? But it was also a very ambitious project, right? She's going for this kind of unified account of the mind and the brain. And so even if there are ways in which what she was doing in that book, it sort of captures broad things about what the relationship between neuroscience and philosophy looked like in the 1980s, the view gets associated, or the term neurophilosophy gets associated particularly with her work and the work of her and her philosophical marriage partner, Paul Churchill, right, which often comes with this particular set of ideas about eliminative materialism, that neurophilosophy is sort of a method for getting you to the idea that there's nothing, there's no need for minds, and the kind of concepts of minds will eliminate those and talk entirely in terms of the brain. And I think, and so if people have an understanding of what neurophilosophy is, it's either shorthand for that kind of a research project, or it's sort of stuck around as sort of shorthand for projects where you take traditional philosophical questions, you go look at the brain to see what the brain has to say, and you get rid of that traditional philosophical puzzle by realizing there isn't room for that kind of thing in the brain. And those projects have sort of become wildly unpopular when we think about other ways that we might engage with neuroscience instead. So John Bickel and Churchill work with Pete Van Dyck and Tony Landreth in the Stanford Encyclopedia and a few other places, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and a few other places, has worked on making a distinction between neurophilosophy and philosophy of neuroscience as two different ways you might engage these two disciplines. Where neurophilosophy is where you take a perennial philosophical question and then you go to the brain and see if the brain can answer it. So maybe if you have a view of free will, right, that says that, deciding to act has to precede the initiation of action, you go to the brain, you see if those things are really in that order. Oh, they're not, no free will, or something like that. Whereas philosophy of neuroscience, right, is a project that explores the foundational issues of neuroscience and reflects on philosophy of science's, right, it's a reflection of the general trend we see in philosophy of science, that philosophy of science becomes the philosophy of the sciences, the special sciences that do particular things. And so as neuroscience grows as a field, philosophy of neuroscience becomes a particular way of exploring the particular questions that matter to philosophers of neuroscience. Right. And so Bickel, in a very recent paper, I think it's been out online for a couple of months. I don't know if not like anyone cares if the print version is out yet, but I don't know that it's at that stage yet. But in this new paper, right, if you can see the title, it's called Lessons for Experimental Philosophy from the Rise and Fall of Neurophilosophy. Right? So Bickel actually doesn't just see these two things as sort of distinct ways that you might engage philosophy and neuroscience. He sees it as a sort of progression over time, right? That there's a sort of natural progression from being neurophilosophers about the relationship to being philosophers of neuroscience. That as neuroscience matures, right, as the science became richer, the work became more technical and more specific, and so philosophers wanted to engage with neuroscientists. They had to sort of, in very Bickel terms, they had to sit on the bench next to the neuroscientist and do the work, right? And as you start to attend to the details and particular practices of neuroscience, you become much less invested in the kind of traditional philosophical questions, right? You're not there to do that. You're there to, right, sort of help the neuroscientist along with what are their questions to begin with. Right, so a quote from the paper, he says, "The increasingly complicated and sophisticated scientific details themselves take greater fascination. The juicy questions lying open at the foundations of the actual neurosciences, not to mention the increasing opportunities to work side by side with practicing neurosciences to address them, trump the early calls to revolutionize philosophy." Right? So this is what philosophy of neuroscience has become, and what it sort of should be and aspire to, according to Bickel. And I think in many ways this is right. And so, but it's also a very limited way of thinking about what the interactions between philosophy and neuroscience can be. And so I'm saying yes, but, or if I were trying to channel Tal from yesterday, I might just say that's one thing we do, right? But this portrays, this sort of gives us a picture of what the philosopher's role is relative to the neuroscientific work, that portrays neuroscience as having a particularly settled foundation, where the remaining questions might be sort of empirical ones, or there might be, right, there's work left to be done, but there's no lingering, perennial sort of conceptual challenges that have to be addressed in a way. And I think that just isn't true, right? And I think for a lot of ways of engaging philosophical and neuroscientific work, there are perennial conceptual challenges that remain, right? And maybe they're not traditional philosophical questions in the sense that we've been asking literally some version of it since Plato or something like that. And maybe we're not asking them because we're hoping to, burn down philosophy in some sense. And maybe people that are asking those questions aren't straightforwardly philosophers, whatever that means, but they're theoretical questions, or they're sort of guiding questions of how we think about what the important and framing concepts are. And there's work there to be done, neurophilosophical work there to be done. So in a way, I feel like I'm saying to the philosopher's version of what Felipe was saying yesterday about if you're trying to do the piecemeal work of figuring out how to think about certain cognitive and neural structures, then maybe if you're a neuroscientist, you should think about hiring philosophers, and maybe if you're a philosopher, you should think about putting your sign out and saying that you're for hire to do this kind of work, that your job is to actually think about the ways that these things are related to one another. So maybe neurophilosophy has fallen, but it should get back up, right? That there's a notion of this term that actually that should come back. And so when I was reading this recent paper of Bickel's and thinking about the sort of demise of neurophilosophy and the way that he tells that story, that sort of prompted me to actually pull down my copy of Churchill's Neurophilosophy and flip through it, which was inspiring to me. And what happened when I did that was I realized the sort of the hints of eliminative materialism, the way that story is supposed to go, that's all in there. But also what's in there is this kind of really beautiful picture of philosophy and neuroscience is engaged in a sort of co-evolutionary project in figuring out what the mind brain is. Right? And so she had a particular idea about how that evolution was going to go. But if you sort of strip that away and kind of look at the methodological framing throughout, it's actually kind of inspiring to read. Like, these ideas like, well, here are some traditional conceptual puzzles that we have. The brain tells us one thing, that refines the concept that we have. Then we go back, we test something new. Right? It's not clear. I don't think it's obvious that you get to a particular solution in the ways that she thought you did by engaging in this practice. But it's a nice characterization of what a lot of philosophers who engage with neuroscience are doing. Right? I think for things that I care about, it sort of does nicely capture, when it comes to thinking about the nature of memory and sort of what are conceptual orientations and the apparatus we use to think about that, and how that's constrained by what we discover about how the mechanisms of memory work. That captures nicely what's going on in these cases in a way that a kind of more brute picture of philosophy of neuroscience doesn't. So I don't know that it necessarily has to be that term, but it already exists. Someone sort of pioneered this idea. It's been 3 decades. Maybe it's time to bring it back and sort of strip it of some of its negative connotations. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I think that there are connections. Hopefully you can see what I would think of as the connections between that project and projects in cognitive ontology. So the way I'm putting it here, and maybe this isn't is saying that cognitive ontology is in a sense a neurophilosophical project, or neurophilosophy is a cognitive ontology project, or they're related projects that need a new way of being characterized, right? But they're similar in spirit, and there's this idea that we're not gonna, I think if there's any resounding theme from yesterday, right, it's not like, you're not just gonna get some kind of, we're not gonna get a structure just by wanting there to be a structure. We have to think about what it is we want that structure, what's guiding our assumptions in various ways. And there's neurophilosophical work to be done in thinking about that, right? So just things that were coming up yesterday, articulating versions of what it might look like to be a pragmatist or a pluralist, what kinds of assumptions are guiding our models and our investigations, right? How we think about what's real, what it means for something to be a pattern, whether there's any sense in which that's a real thing, right? How we balance the values of explanation and prediction, right? These are sort of questions that are in the spirit of the kind of thing that I've been thinking is at least part of what's happening in some parts of neurophilosophy, or some parts of philosophy of neuroscience that might aptly be called neurophilosophical projects, or should be called that. Another thing is that there's a way in which cognitive ontology isn't special, and I mean this in a good way, right? That it's not, I mean, it is a particular problem, but it's not a unique and isolated problem. And I've been thinking a lot about, and yesterday helped me think more in particular about a quotation that's in, so there was a special issue of Philosophical Explorations a couple of years ago that Colin Klein and others edited, and the sort of intro framing essay of that special issue called What is Cognitive Ontology Anyway? They make this claim. They say, a consistent nomenclature is only possible, this is after they've delineated different ideas about what different notions of cognitive ontology that can be at work. And they say a consistent nomenclature is only possible if you have a consensus about the reference of the terms. That is what the domain of inquiry ought to be. And this is a marked contrast between gene ontology and cognitive ontologies. And in the case of gene ontologies, there's procedures for delineating genes and their products, and this occurs against a background of rough agreement about how genetics works. Right? And when I first read this, I thought, like, no. And I had this very strong pushback to this. But that's because I had an understanding of gene ontology that's very different than the sense of gene ontology that that Russ was talking about in his talk yesterday. So I actually didn't know about the Go project, that this was a particular term and frame. What I was thinking of as the gene ontology is a debate that happens in cellular biology and that philosophers of biology have talked about, which is the debates about the concept of the gene and what that means over time. And that actually is a very much more messy sort of ontological question that I think in many respects looks a whole lot like our worries about cognitive ontology more generally. And I haven't had a chance to really look at the Go project yet, but that strikes me as a kind of project in the ontology of molecular genetic conceptions. It doesn't have maybe anything to do with population genetics conceptions of what the gene is. So even to the extent that it's giving us an ontology, it might be giving us one of the many gene ontologies. And so thinking about the ways in which it isn't special might be really helpful to us. And so I was prompted by making that connection last night, because I was sort of floored by that quotation in the paper because of how I read, and assuming that they mean gene ontology in the sense of yesterday, not this sense. But I think there's lessons to be learned from this sense, right? And that are sort of productive for thinking about what motivates and shapes, what are our top-down concepts that motivate and create these ontologies, parts of where they come from, and how they frame not just sort of folk concepts, but the way that we sort of scientifically investigate many of these concepts, right? So I mean, the idea of something being hereditary and loose notions exists for a long time, I'm supposing, but it becomes a focus. This is a very canned version of cellular biology and of philosophy of biology, right? But so in the 19th century, people become increasingly interested in the concept of heredity and what that concept is doing and different ways that you might understand how things are inherited and moved throughout time. And eventually, as certain pictures of heredity went out, you get this notion of the classic Mendelian gene, right? This kind of pairwise combinations that happen in certain ways. And you get excited about that idea as a kind of clear concept, this idea of this thing called the gene. And then you go looking for the mechanisms that are going to do that, right? And so there's a way in which molecular genetics, the success of the existence of that, undercuts the very thing that it was inspired to search for, right? And so a lot of philosophy of biology and certain parts of biology more broadly are debating like how to understand what that sort of ontological shift is, right? So there are a range of views, even in that particular debate, about is this the same term that's been adapted and changed over? Is this a radically new concept? Should we see them as a sort of pluralism of concepts? How do we think about the relationship between them? And there's no obvious picture about how to do that, right? And that's only dealing with the picture of the relationship between the sort of classical gene notion and the molecular gene notion, which doesn't necessarily touch notions of the gene as it exists in population genetics and issues about epigenetic inheritance, developmental concepts of the gene, etc. Right? And so philosophers of biology have been doing, I guess you wouldn't call it neurophilosophical work in the sense, right? But there is this very nice, it's a nice model of how you do sort of conceptual and scientific interplay about getting clear on what the different options might be for thinking about this concept, right? Whether it has multiple uses, whether it has no use, whether it should be replaced, whether it should be updated, right? And all versions of those kinds of views exist, and you have nice articulations of views of how concepts are updated, views about pluralism of concepts, right? And eliminativism, sort of error theories of those concepts, right? As a sort of nice model for thinking about what kinds of options might be out there. And one of the lessons I think that you can get from thinking about those kinds of things is that what matters for the concept of the gene, and I think there's even some very interesting studies of where philosophers of biology have looked at how this kind of concept is at work in the scientists who were doing the molecular, right? How is this concept, what is their concept of the gene, and how is that framing what they do? And they realize, like, sort of their kind of ontological notion in some sense might not map up in deep ways with the kinds of experimental inquiry they're doing. Nonetheless, it sort of fuels their investigation, and that's why it matters, right? What matters about this concept isn't sort of ultimately whether it gets us to one ontology, but whether it promotes fruitful inquiry, right, and actually allows us to answer the kinds of questions we want to answer, right? So whether we, at the end of the day, call this an ontology or sort of productive framework that's different than maybe another productive framework, maybe that doesn't matter quite so much, right? And so in philosophy of biology, this has been a motivation. All of this work is one of the central motivations for being pluralist about certain kinds of concepts. Where pluralist doesn't mean anything goes, right? But it means insofar as you have distinct investigatory research projects with clear agendas, you might get different ontologies, and it's okay to let that sort of thing exist. Just to put certain ways of thinking about pluralism very quickly. And I think that there's a lesson in that, which is a lesson that's I was sort of already coming at, obviously, all day yesterday, but it's sort of a way of being reminded about the idea that we don't care about ontology for ontology's sake, or maybe sometimes we do, we say that we do, or we care about kind of carving nature out of its joints and like letting it all fall away. But I think the point in Russ's talk yesterday where he showed us the kind of hypothetical abstract from 2030 was a great illustration of like, it's not clear that we do care about like seeing the joints just for the sake of seeing the joints, right? Because like, okay, well then what do I do with that, right? If suppose those are the joints, that's not very interesting or informative in a way that tells me what I wanted to do, right? I care about an ontology as a sort of, like as a way of answering and structuring a kind of research program instead of investigations that I want to hold, right? And so insofar as we have lots of different questions about genes and answering them drives us to different purposes, maybe we end up with multiple ontologies, right? And so I think it's a helpful way of stepping back and thinking about, well, what is it that we want out of a cognitive ontology, and whether all of the things, it's just, if we want to explain cognition, we want to predict behavior, we want to know something about individual differences and cross-species comparisons, we want to treat disease and trauma and disorder, right? Those are all things that we want to do. Whether those are all going to give us one ontology, it's sort of, it's really unclear, right? If we could just sort of get, if we could just ask the universe, like, what is the cognitive ontology? And they were like, it's 14 things, and here they are, right? Like, that's not like, it's not even clear what you would do with that sort of answer, sort of stripped of an investigatory framework that drives you into it. And so there's a way in which I think, thinking about that lesson from the gene, that's actually, I've been thinking about the lesson from gene ontologies for ways of thinking about concepts in the philosophy, concepts in memory, and particularly because there's ways in which the concept of what it takes to remember something, a kind of general concept, guides the way that we've done inquiry into what the mechanisms of memory are over time. And that's gotten shifted and moved around in ways in which it's important, I think, to do something very similar for that question. And that's the sense in which I mean that what I'm thinking about feels like a way of coming sideways at worries about cognitive ontology. It's sort of a way of thinking about what one of our commitments is that guides and then eventually informs the views that we have about why particular brain structures do what they do, because we have certain ideas about what is guiding the mental processes or capacities that they're supposed to be engaged in. So the concept that I spend time thinking about that I think sort of a way of, again, of kind of cutting sideways in on issues of cognitive ontology is the concept of the memory trace or the engram, right? Very generically speaking, right? I think there's some notion of the idea of a memory trace. It is as old, it exists for as long as talking about memory exists, right? And over time, it sort of morphs into, and people use the notion of an engram as a way of talking about sort of biological neural mechanism that's going to be the basis of, or the kind of implementation of that memory trace. So there's a kind of continuity of ways of thinking about this that exists from the time that we thought that memories might just be impressions in wax, right, that we get in sort of ancient Greek philosophy, all the way to thinking about what it is that CA3 neurons in the hippocampus might be doing, right? That there's a kind of very basic idea of memory, which is this idea that if I have, and I'm saying memory generically, where I think the paradigmatic case is going to be something like event or episodic memory, but I'm not going to sort of elaborate on defining that, in part because I think that is precisely part of what's at issue between various conceptions of thinking about what's going to suffice as the mechanism for this thing. Where I just have in mind a kind of general notion that exists in various permutations throughout the history of people talking about remembering, which is just, if you have some sort of experience, you undergo some kind of an event, and then later you're able to, in some way, relive that experience, produce the information from that event, there has to have been some change to you, right, in virtue of which that is made possible. And whatever that thing is, that's the thing we're talking about as the memory trace or the engram. That basic idea, right, sort of has structured theories of remembering for a very long time and serves as a kind of functional description and basis for a project in molecular neuroscience of looking for what could possibly be that engram, right? So the notion of the engram actually comes from Richard Zeman, a German biologist right in the early 20th century, where he doesn't actually find what it is, he just postulates that there has to be one and gives it this particular term, right? So it's, for him, the idea is that there's supposed to be, if we sort of articulate what engram theory is, right, that remembering is going to have to involve some kind of structural, physical or chemical structural change to the brain as a result of learning, which is then reactivated during remembering, right? That's the kind of thing that we're looking for. Again, he says, I don't know what it is, but there's got to be one, right? And even for, this theory becomes a sort of such an entrenched way of looking for and thinking about the mechanisms of these things, that even the people that are most famous for denying that there actually is one are still sort of in the grips of the theory in the way that they talk about it from time to time. So Carl Lashley, right, sort of famous for talking about the demise of the engram and throughout his repeated searchings, the inability to find it, right? And he says at some point in the paper, I sometimes feel in reviewing the evidence on the localization of the memory trace that the necessary conclusion is that learning is just not possible, right? The idea that this thing is essential for guiding this concept is so strong that even those who think it doesn't exist, right, sort of rather, modus tollens than modus ponens in the sense, right? So it's sort of central guiding concept that over time, right, like we have in the long-term potentiation, a lot of details that other people in the room know a great deal more about even than I do, and aren't relevant necessarily to what I want to say today. We get an idea about what that structure is supposed to be, and we get an account from people like the Tanigawa lab at MIT that does a lot of optogenetic work on the nature of the engram, right? Has what they take to be a slightly updated version of Zeman's view, right? Where they say the engram is going to be something like the enduring physical and chemical changes as a result of activation that can be subsequently reactivated, right? So this notion slightly updated as we discover more about what the actual mechanisms are, continues over time, right? So there are many different projects. This is one sort of way of thinking about how that concept works, right, and how it gets articulated, right? And one thing that becomes incredibly important to that project, right, is the fact that we have to deal with the engram as an enduring physical or chemical change, right? So in order to play its role in this sort of conceptual picture, right, to be the change that is the result of your experience that then makes possible later recall or information or behavior that reflects that experience, it has to persist, right? It has to persist in some form or another. And so we end up starting to care a lot about the kind of molecular process, or the neural processes by which that might happen. We start to care about the processes of consolidation, right? So this becomes the sort of mechanistic way of thinking about, or sort of the neural way of thinking about how that stability and structure is going to be provided over time, right? The process by which the engram or the memory trace becomes stable and becomes an enduring thing. And we know that we often make a distinction between two forms of consolidation in the standard picture, between molecular consolidation, as happens rapidly in the seconds and minutes following having a particular experience, and systems consolidation of memory over a longer period of time, where that's anywhere from days and weeks to the process of a lifetime. And so I'm talking about this particular concept here as a sort of guiding concept, or sort of theoretical, conceptual commitment we have to thinking about how memory works, that we then go and investigate and look at the mechanisms that exist in the brain. And I think it's interesting to think about how, if you see that as one particular project in a part of neuroscience for thinking about this idea of memory, it's interesting to think about how you can engage with this project either as a philosopher of neuroscience or as a sort of neurophilosophical project. So there's work in the philosophy of neuroscience. I'm just picking on a particular debate because it talks about memory consolidation, right? There are ways of giving, which some in the room are more famous for than others, of giving accounts of what explanatory practices in neuroscience look like, right? And they're the process of uncovering and describing mechanisms, right? And there's a particular debate that happens between John Bickel and Bill Bechtel, particularly on this case of memory consolidation. So I'm just focusing on this, right? So they look at the sort of molecular processes by which we think the memories become stable over time. And they have a debate about whether or not those mechanisms are ruthlessly reductive or mechanistically reductive. And that's a debate that sort of says that, okay, well, we know here's the mechanism of protein synthesis by which we think this happens. I'm not belaboring the details today because it doesn't matter for my purposes, right? But where the distinction is really one about what role the higher levels of investigation play in that explanatory process, right? So the ruthlessly reductive says it's only cellular and molecular processes, everything else is merely heuristic. And the mechanistically reductive says that the other higher levels of organization matter, right? And that debate is a productive and fruitful debate in some senses. We get clearer over time on what it means, right? As iterations of this debate in different ways happen, we get clearer on what it means for something, maybe we get clearer on what it means for something to be merely heuristic versus actually part of the investigation. We get articulations from Carl and from other people about levels of mechanisms and how we should think about the levels and their integration, right? And we get a picture of, right, we get a description of what's happening in the neuroscience, and we get a clear method for how you make progress in the philosophy of neuroscience, which is to pull out examples of particular experiments and show whether or not they're the kind of explanations that involve one of these forms of reduction or the other, right? And this is a project that I'm not belittling the project and its fruitfulness and its interest, but it's not the only project in town, and it's not the one that I think is sort of, it's not a project that can stand in isolation, but there's actually neurophilosophy to be done in thinking about the process of memory consolidation, right? So these are supposed to be explanations of the mechanisms by which memory consolidation happens. Well, what actually is the thing being explained? What is memory consolidation, right? We can have debates about which levels of neuroscientific practice best explain the process of protein synthesis as it relates to stabilizing these forms of memory over time, but we need a clearer account of how doing that relates to the phenomenon of memory and the perpetuation of this thing called the memory trace, or the engram. And that's not something that standard project is going to give you an answer to. So I just put up here, again, a kind of numbered out version of what the Tanagawa version of the engram definition was supposed to be, right? This sort of enduring chemical change that is carried out by a certain neuron of subpopulation and can subsequently be reactivated, right? But I think if we think more broadly is a sort of neurophilosophical project about what it is that we're wanting, what the definition or notion of an engram or a memory trace has to have involved in it. All of what Tanigawa, all of what they're describing is really, can be kind of cashed out in, or sort of ways of cashing out the details of the fact that what we're looking for is some kind of enduring and perhaps distinctive structural change to physical change to the organism, which is one essential component of the memory trace, but it's not the engram, but it's not the only component that matters, right? So the other component that matters, it's critical for thinking about as part of our concept and our definition, is that in some respects, the engram or the memory trace has to be content-bearing or content-supporting. In the sense that if you think about the kind of very basic sort of toy example I was giving you, right? You have an experience, later you're able to think about or do something as a result of that experience, in virtue of some kind of change to you that, that is going to be the thing that persists over time and makes that possible, right? It can't just be any old change in order to be the engram or the memory trace, right? It has to be the kind of thing that is cognitive in the right way. It has to be able to bear or support content, where I don't want to have some kind of, I don't have some rich idea about of a philosopher's notion of mental content here. I simply just mean to push on the idea that there has to be some form of cognitive change. So if you think about the contrast of, maybe last night didn't happen, but suppose that last night I'm walking in my hotel room and I stub my toe really hard and I get a very nice bruise on the end of my toe, and then I wake up this morning and my foot is sort of throbbing and I look down at my bruised toe, and as a result of that I think about the process of stubbing my toe, right? What we have is I underwent an experience, there's been a change to me, and as a result of that experience I now think about that past event. My bruise is not a memory trace, it's not going to qualify as an engram, right, supporting that memory, right? It's a cue to remember, right? But it's not playing that sort of cognitive, content-bearing, content-supporting, whatever role that it is that we want that trait state to have. And we have to think about, it's a difficult question to think about what the relationship is going to be between that physical structure and that content, and the many ways that those things can go. And it's got to be part of our definition in order to get that sort of thing going. So I think it's important to recognize from the beginning that what we're asking for is a mechanism that isn't just a mechanism to support this process, but to support a process that is uniquely cognitive in that way. And it matters, I think, for how we think about this concept over time, and this is where the sort of connection to concerns about ontology begins to come back in, right? Which is that if you think about these two features as being critical to the ways that we think about a memory trace, that there has to be, that it sort of simultaneously has these two features, that it's some kind of enduring, in some sense or another, physical or structural change that is capable of supporting content, that is cognitive in some way. These actually inform two distinct routes by which we can identify the engram or the memory trace, or think about it over time. And this matters because of the fact that the memory trace has to be enduring and it has to be persistent, which means that we have to track and re-identify this thing over time, right? Our interest in this state is something that persists, right? It's the change that's supposed to happen if I had stubbed my toe, right? It's supposed to be the mental change that happens to me as a result of that experience, that for as long as I'm able to continue thinking about it, that experience is still a part of my mental life, right? So we're going to need to be able to track and re-identify this thing over time. And as we do that in various distinct projects and think about this, we might use different methods for doing so, right? We might either track it over time by its content, or we might track it over time by its structure. And those are different, and we get sort of conceptual or methodological I won't say problems, but conflicts that arise when we recognize, or it becomes more complicated, when we recognize the ways in which the features, both of these features of the engram are dynamic, right? So it's not as if whatever structural change is happening in the brain is happening in some form of isolation that's not moving or doing anything over time, right? The brain is a dynamic system that's constantly moving and evolving. The particular cells and processes involved are changing. There are views, I'll talk about in a minute, that the engram is moving over time and it's not being held by the same cells. So it's going to be physically dynamic. Neural dynamics are going to make a difference. And we also know that the content is changing over time, right? That's the sort of grand lesson of cognitive psychology of memory over the last 40 or 50 years. Right? And one that we see iterated in various ways. The contents of memories are updated and changed and rehearsed over time. So both of these features are critical to the memory trace. Both of them are going to change over time, and yet we have to keep looking for the thing that plays this role over time. And this is, a really deep, I think, sort of neurophilosophical puzzle, and to put it in total philosopher's terms, although I'm sort of loath to do so, it's sort of, we have to start asking the question, what are the identity conditions by which we're going to identify the engram over time, right? How is it we decide it's the same engram as the engram that it used to be? And it turns out anyone who's investigating these various questions and how we think about the mechanisms of memory consolidation has to have a view of this in mind, right? That's framing what it is that they do, and not everyone has the same view. And that shapes what it is to have conversations about how to do this. So this is I'm giving a very fast sort of caricature about what those options might be, but here's one way of thinking about them, right? So one standard way of thinking about the view of systems consolidation of memory over time, what often gets called the standard model of consolidation, right, is that initially when you're encoding episodic memories, right, they initially rely on the hippocampus. When you sort of I first formed that traumatic memory of stubbing my toe in the hotel room. It's stored in my hippocampus, but over time, right, it's eventually going to consolidate in ways that stop relying on the hippocampus and rely on the cortex instead, right? So more remote memories don't require having a hippocampus. So what makes something the mechanism that supports memory over time? What makes it the engram? What makes it the memory trace, whatever you want to call it? It's the content, right? The sort of idea that remote memories no longer rely on the hippocampus is driven by an assumption that because I can recall the same content, because maybe you can ask me about stubbing my toe 20 years later and I can tell you about it even though I've had some kind of hippocampal lesion, right? That's evidence of the fact that the memory trace has moved. So the basis for that assumption is that it's identified by its content. The standard model of consolidation, whether it was ever fully accepted is one thing, but particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, has received a number of different challenges. One of which is the discovery of mechanisms of reconsolidation, right? This idea that memories become stable and fixed at the molecular level is not a permanent thing. That once a memory is reactivated, the consolidated memories enter this sort of labile state by which they can either be updated or edited or distorted, whatever you like, as a function of that process. And this is in these kinds of debates and what people think about as they're thinking about this view of memory, right, has a sort of idea, so I can form a memory of stubbing my toe and have the trace of doing that. And I later reactivate that memory, but I do so while thinking about a conference in a very different place. It's possible I'll edit that memory in various ways that change features of that content. And because of the nature of reconsolidation, that can become stored as part of the features of that trace. And if that's the right view to have, then what we have here is an idea that what makes something the engram or the memory trace is identified by the neurons that support that structure, even if the content changes. So the way that I track it over time is by what kind of neural mechanism supports this, rather than by what the nature of the content is. Such that the content can change, but the thing stays the same. I'm not trying to say that these are sort of irreconcilable pictures, but they're driven by different ideas about what the fundamental sort of motivating picture is going to be, and it matters to keep track of that. And if you think about ways that people have pushed on or tried to elaborate on each of these over time, if you think about alternative conceptions of consolidation, so ways of pushing back on the standard model of consolidation, one of the more prominent ones of those is the multiple trace theory, which becomes something of the transformation view, right? Which says, no, it's never the remote episodic memories never stop depending on the hippocampus, right? What happens in the cortex is an entirely different thing. These are sort of semanticized versions of the same memory. So sort of a different reading of the empirical, it's already a messy empirical literature about what is serving as the neural basis of these remote memories, but a very different fundamental guiding assumption about what's happening in these cases. So that it just is the case that if it's episodic remembering, it has to involve the hippocampus. Where behind that is a sort of very strong view about what the content of episodic memory is, and what the function and neural structure of the hippocampus is such that it can support that, right? And so there's a sort of just flat denial. Anything that moves to the cortex just can't be episodic memory because that's not a cortical structure that's not something that's not part of what that part of neural structure does, right? That's not what that neural system is up to. Only the hippocampus can do that, right? And same with issues about reconsolidation. There are views about the consolidation process that come out of Engrams and his colleagues, right, where you think about the consolidation process as a process of modifying schema. So if you think about, there are debates about whether consolidation and reconsolidation, sort of process of reactivating, whether they are the same, whether they should be the same. And Engrams and his group like to push back on the idea that there's an assumption that the first time that you start, the idea that when I walk across my hotel room and I stub my toe, this is sort of like going to lay down some kind of unique engram, as if this is, going to land into a set of neural structures that haven't done anything before. That from the very beginning, sort of stabilizing a particular memory just is already reconsolidating it, absorbing it into pre-existing schematic structures, right? So this sort of idea that there is no distinction to be drawn between episodic and semantic memory, that new information is always being absorbed in these particular ways, and that's not going to be a useful guide for keeping track of or thinking about how we look for a memory trace over time. And this is just a very fast sketch of what are a range of different views that involve very different, I think, substantive conceptual ways of thinking about the details of how you want to flesh out what our commitments about a memory trace or an engram are, all of which are, in some sense, talking at cross purposes when trying to investigate the kind of what the neural structure underlying these processes is, right? So the debates are often waged in terms of what we see with particular neuropsychological patients, what we see in neuroimaging, what we understand from particular molecular knockout kinds of cases, but that's not going to resolve the issue insofar as part of what's guiding the disagreement is a fundamentally different conception of what the nature of this kind of memory is, what kind of things that it's doing. And I think it's not a coincidence that sort of alternative conceptions of what the engram or the memory trace is, what it's made of, and what its contents are informing different views of what the hippocampus is doing, right? So if you think about the review papers that Felipe was talking about yesterday, here's different ideas about what the hippocampus is fundamentally up to, right? Those are related to different ideas about what the individual memory traces are doing, right? The idea about what the fundamental process of memory is, and how I don't have a sense of which one is informing which other one, right? But these ways of thinking about what's required for remembering, what the essential features are for tracking these things over time, what the nature of that content is and how it relates to its structure, they're informing and informed by views about what that particular cortical structure is doing, what it's going to do in the cognitive ontology. So insofar as we want to ask questions about, what should our cognitive ontology be, we can think about ways that people get into that question about with regards to how it is that they think about particular concepts or particular structures, the way that informs why they want to cut the things up the way that they do. And I think that sort of intersection might be a fruitful way of thinking. And in particular for philosophers of neuroscience interested in memory, like myself, I think there's actually a great deal of neurophilosophical work to be done articulating these distinct conceptions of what the memory trace or the engram is, and sort of in particular, how we're going to think about ways that people want to track and keep track of the evolution of this thing over time and count for its sort of stability and persistence in the fact, in the face of many different kinds of dynamics and contexts and updating and changes. So I'll stop.
Thank you. That was great. So I want to push back a little bit on what is exactly, what kind of existence does the content of a memory trace need to have for it to count as content bearing in the way in which you?
Yeah.
I mean, we have had this conversation many times before, but I feel that there is a way in which the neuroscientist might say, I don't need to have a tracking of the particular mental content that it is sort of encoding a particular event. All I need to do is a very reliable way in which if I manipulate one part of the brain, when I turn it on, people do remember the toe and stubbing the toe, and if I turn it off, they don't.
Right.
So I don't have to be committed to this particular part of the brain is constantly encoding my towing. I just have to be committed with the fact that 100% of the time when I click it on, it either remembers or not remembers.
Yeah. Good. So I agree. That's why I keep putting up this phrase of like content bearing or content supporting. Like in the sense that it has to be a cognitive change. There are plenty of molecular mechanisms that happen in cell biology that aren't supporting sort of that kind of informational or cognitive thing. I take that to be a distinct thing that at least some neurons do at least some of the time, and that's a kind of $1 million version of the question. Maybe $1 million is not enough anymore for that kind of work, but like the sort of interface of thinking about what it means for neurostructures to be, what it means for the mind and the brain to be the same thing, doing the same thing, whatever way you want to think about that is. So there's that worry. I mean, I think in some sense, I totally agree with you, and that's where I wanted to be about that question. Like, you don't have to answer that question. You just sort of like, I just know, I give my functional description of like, here's the episode, and then I just look for the thing, right? And I become very good at the nature of the interventions I use. Like, here's the mechanism, and if I take it out, I don't get it, and if I keep it in, I get it, and if I activate it, optogenetically even, I should make it show up. But then I have to, but I think once you realize that it is content supporting, it's right, it's making a cognitive, it's a cognitive difference to what I do, and I recognize that I started thinking about neural dynamics, so it's your fault I'm thinking about this, because you started thinking about that. I started thinking about like, well, how is this thing going to move and change over time? And it turns out the structure is going to change, and the content's going to change too. And now the details about how those things hook up with one another matters for how I know which one to start following when they start to part ways. Right? So is it still that, like, if I reactivate it and the content is wildly different, is this is this an edited memory trace? Is this a new memory trace laid down? Is it destroyed? Like, how am I going to characterize that? And there's sort of substantive commitments guiding that debate. And so I think as much as it'd be great to avoid it, I don't know if we can. Or at least we have, and I don't know what the right answer to that is supposed to be, but at least we should be clear about what assumptions we're making in pursuing it in a particular way.
So I wanted to ask you about the broader project of neurophilosophy, which I couldn't be more excited about. I was like basically squeaking when you said that at the meeting, hopefully on the inside. But I wanted to ask you how you see this kind of unfolding, right? Because this is something I'm really interested in, but I haven't really found a way of kind of reviving it other than by case, right? Other than like doing it and saying, hey, look, this works and this is useful. But it seems like you're starting to think about like a bigger revival. So what do you have in mind for that?
I mean, it's a great question. That's probably an over-drinks kind of, but I don't necessarily have it. Although I think it started for me, like, as full disclosure, because when I was sort of wrestling with these kind of models of consolidation and what the assumptions were over time, and I was like writing up an abstract about this, my husband, who's also a philosopher, I was like trying to come up with the title, and he's like, well, this is kind of like neurophilosophy. And I was like, oh, like, well, thanks for that. Like, you know, it's like the worst insult you can give me, like, go away. And he was like, no, you know, in the like looser sense of this. And I was like, that's not really, and he was like, well, yeah, you know, for a lot of the things we care about, you care about, I care about, like, that's the, you know, it's a sort of question about what the nature, like, there's an assumption about the nature of memory that changes over time that guides this work, and that characterizes, you know, so it started us on a conversation about a lot of projects that, like, look at the program of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, how much, you know, look at these, you know, look at things that are happening at the Philosophy of Science Association, look at these various places. These are, you know, sort of substantively loaded questions about how, you know, maybe this isn't it isn't always the perennial question of free will or something, but they're philosophical questions in some sense. So, I mean, I don't know how you make clear to people. I mean, I think part of it is, like, if this is the right term to use or the right framework to use, you've got to handle the fact that even people who are doing it don't want to accept it. That's why I was telling that story. So there's that sort of PR campaign issue. Yeah, so I don't know. But glad that someone wants to do it too. So we'll figure it out together.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm just curious if there are different opinions that are explicit at all about the ontological categories that people use for thinking about the Engram. I'm really thinking about the neural side of things. I mean, Lashley seems to imagine that it's something like a hidden planet.
Yeah.
That if you turn your telescope in the right portion of the sky, you'll see. But then I can imagine somebody thinking that it's more appropriate, just given the things that you've said, some of the reconsolidation work, it's more appropriate to think about it maybe as a process that's extended in time, and we should have to think about individuation criteria for processes, or disposition, maybe it's a disposition, and the whole, and so I'm wondering if maybe one way to try to categorize these different views would first be to get the way that they think ontologically about the memory trace and which ontological categories they're appealing.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful, and I like, in some sense, I feel like I'm in the midst of trying to do that, although not that neatly described, by trying to track down the various ones and how they're changing over time. And I think, that's a way of making sense of kind of what the kind of mostly tacit, like, kind of guiding ontological framework is, and then the ways that it changes over time. So one thing I was gonna try to talk about today, but then took out, was the Tanagawa group that has this very cellular, like, you know, you find the cells, and that's the thing that's going to be the engram. That group now has started, so in all the kind of debates about the systems model of consolidation, like it starts in the hippocampus and then it moves to cortex, right? Because of their ability to do this sort of optogenetic tagging, they see that like, oh, there are cells in various areas of cortex that are sort of tagged with the information from the very beginning. And you can optogenetically reactivate them and get the memory, but you can't otherwise reactivate that. You can't reactivate them by normal retrieval mechanisms. So like, so it looks like, so they were like, well, we need a notion of a silent engram. And so now they have this idea in a set of papers, right? So like, they're taking their own notion and realizing, well, if this is true, like, so it's not just that the engram is like, you know, stored and then activated, but it can be silent. So they have this idea that hippocampal engrams start out as active and the cortical ones start out as silent, and then over time they switch, right? There's some sort of messages that get said that change the sort of dendritic spines effectively. I think that's what they think it is at the moment, and that's what's going to do the work. And so we need our notion of engram to handle different kinds of reactivation doing different things. But that's kind of playing with their fundamental concept. It doesn't, they admit, it's a Nature Reviews paper where they give that three-step definition, and they start talking about silent engrams at the end, and they're like, yeah, so now our definition of the engram is wrong. At least we have to have a, you know, now we got to talk about different forms of activation, and like, but we'll fix that, right? Like, and you know, it's sort of interesting to think about what's guiding those various projects. So what do they do when the definition or the ontology they have, right, is sort of met by discovery that doesn't do it, and how does it update in various ways? So yeah, at the moment I'm just trying to track all of that, which is, you know, these are not small literature, so I'm kind of just picking at different pieces at the moment. But if you follow any one for very long, I think there is a framework and there are a set of assumptions, and they're not shared across research programs in the same way, although the terminology is shared. And so there are sort of frustrations about, you know, why we're sort of throwing, you know, examples of neuropsychological patients at each other, but like that's never going to solve it because we have fundamentally different ideas about like what the nature of the thing is that we're looking for. And so it feels like at least articulating what those differences are might help to make that sort of more part of the conversation. Yeah, sorry.
I think this is related to Carl's question. I find your talk really helpful in thinking about how to understand what a cognitive ontology is supposed to be, which is something I felt sort of unclear on. And I work in the metaphysics of mind, so I'm coming at this from that angle. And like listening to the stuff you said about the engram, the kind of reaction that I had was that like what this word is doing is picking out whatever it is that physically, chemically realizes what I would describe as the ability that memory consists in. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, there's lots of room for all kinds of debates about what it is that realizes that. Metaphysically, there are questions like whether, you know, necessarily has to be any such thing, whether it has to be, you know, consistent in any physically or chemically identifiable way over time. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe my memory shifts into a part of the brain every week just to fuck with us.
Right.
And all kinds like this. And so like this sort of makes it seem to me like the concept of engram isn't really going to belong to an ontology at all. It's ultimately going to be replaced by the things that are doing that functional realizing work. You know, sort of like ontologically, I think here's, you know, there are definitely neurons and the things that they do.
Yeah.
There's like this level between then like that and the, like the memory abilities that I wonder if we, like how that's supposed to belong to the ontology.
Yeah, so I don't have a strong question or a strong answer to it. I like that question because it's part of, I think it helps to connect why I've thought that thinking about the debates about the history of the concept of the gene is very helpful, because it's sort of like, are those like real, you know, what is the gene? And like, well, there are lots of different ways, and that sort of drops out as interesting over time as you sort of use that as a way of guiding what it is that you care about. And so insofar as that's a kind of, I think, the gene is a sort of helpful sort of conceptual tool by which we ask for certain things and answer our questions, right? Because we have a kind of guiding framework of what we expect, what we think could play this role. It can get moved in different ways by different concerns, but we have a guiding conception that we're filling out. The same is true for memory, and that's pretty sort of productive for thinking about the various ways that gets articulated and detailed. I don't know if that gets, so I don't know, I mean, you're the metaphysics person, you tell me what this is.
It's not so clear to think that the things drop out. I mean, like, so Ross yesterday mentioned the example of brain tumors, and my reaction to this was like, well, it turns out there are 3 kinds of brain tumors. If you want to treat them, the differences matter. But it's not like it turns out there aren't brain tumors. And it's like, you know, there's a way in which the idea of the concept of brain tumor doesn't drop out logically, and I think like that's true of memory.
Yeah.
It's not so clear that's true of an engram exactly, like I think these concepts are playing importantly different roles in,
Okay.
it's like the engram's like a placeholder term for me.
For
Like, whatever
Yeah.
it turns out physically does this work.
right. And then
There
I
could
guess
be,
the question is, when you
35,000
realize like,
different kinds of them.
yeah. And so then you sort of refine like, well, are there different ways of doing the same work, or what, what's all, yeah, that's how, I don't know if I have further things to say about that, but that's, I appreciate that.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the content requirement. So you're talking, so you wanted it to not be like this strict like philosopher's content-y thing. When you're talking about that, I was thinking of this paper I read a while ago by Roddy Roediger, where he talks about this exact issue, and he was essentially, the paper is like, we have no idea what a memory trace is because everything fits the definition or nothing does, right? And it's a great example. So like, one kind of heuristic you have to like differentiate like really dumb cases like the toe case is that you have to have, I think there's something like, you have to be able to kind of rationalize, don't put too much into that, but you have to be able to rationalize the kind of thing you do, right? And so the thing you had in mind was implicit memory. So you get these cases where you show people a string of words that are related to like age, and then they'll like behave in a way that's like age related, like they'll walk slower, right? If they have a bunch of old person words in there. That was not a great. Anyway, and so like one way of thinking that's a memory is that you can kind of rationalize the connection between reading words about old and walking slowly. And then he has this great example where it's like, well, if I'm lifting weights, I'm going to become stronger.
Right, but that's not the kind of,
But there's also a kind of way in which you can kind of draw the rational connection between the lifting of the weights and becoming stronger. Okay, so that's like, that was the thing that was in the background, right? And then it's like, it seems like Roddy's like telling us all these things that are just like, we have no idea what the content thing is, right? Because you can't get an account of the content that both includes the right things and excludes the wrong things. So I'm wondering,
if I was solved that problem, No, I agree. I think that yes, I think that that's an important sort of debate and worry and problem to have. And I think in some ways, I think you could have a very rich notion of content that's guiding this, and some accounts do, and have very clear ideas about like, the kind of like impression and wax sort of view is sort of like, well, there's going to be some kind of direct structural relationship between those two things, and that's what you would need, and that's how you would solve that kind of a question. There would be some mental content that take that really seriously in different ways. But I think, in some sense, it's just, like, this is a huge one, but like, this is just sort of, this is the issue about like what things count as cognitive, right? Like, when are we going to count these as the kind of cognition supporting neural processes where we worry about that, about whether plants have cognition, whether certain molecular processes have these, right? We're sort of, that's I think it's part of a bigger question, sort of trying to articulate those things, and I think thinking through particular cases of those worries is helpful. I don't have I'm trying to figure out how you would sort of sort that line, but it matters for thinking about what, I have nothing great to say, except that like, there's a one sense in which I think everyone nowadays wants to agree, like it isn't just some sort of impression in wax, that for whatever episodic memory you have, like there's no sense in which that content is fixed, right? Even if it were linguistic or something, every time you think about it, it could be slightly different, it could be updated, it can just not say exactly the same thing. So it's got to be fluid in some sort of way, or maybe I can display it by nodding to you when you tell me the story versus actually saying it myself. What does it take? And once you're going to let that be broad, then why aren't all, why isn't lifting weights, and otherwise that not going to work? Yes. But thanks. Joe.
I had a comment and then a question. The comment is that it was about neurophilosophy. I thought about this distinction a bit. And when you first talked about analyzing the concept of the engram, I was thinking, well, that's really still philosophy of neuroscience, because philosophers of biology do things like the concept of innateness or the concept of fitness or so forth. But then I started thinking, well, maybe it becomes neurophilosophy when there's a bite back from the philosopher, right? So in a way, like philosophers have said to Benjamin Libet, hey, you're not showing us we don't have free will. We still have this expertise, right? And I think in a way, you're saying to some of these memory researchers, look, like that might not deliver the goods. You might be, telling us about, some of the molecular processes, but they're not necessarily the ones we care about.
Yeah.
If if you have great philosophical masses of memory. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, that maybe neurophilosophy has the kind of like back rather than sort of just the analysis of scientific concept.
Yeah, good. So I think that's a more sort of assertive way of putting it. I guess that would sort of suppose, and maybe in free will it's more of the case, but in the case of like what the requirement of memory is and what it is we're looking for, that seems much less clear and articulated. So there hasn't been, the philosophers' bite back is like sort of more muted just because we haven't worked that out on our end either.
And then the question I had, so I really liked your remarks in the beginning, and I was just curious whether you thought, so when you were telling the story of the gene concept and its change and sort of pluralism, where now you might have like some genes are regulatory, some are coding, and some are on jumping around and all this stuff. I was curious about whether you were thinking at that time that each item in the cognitive ontology, like working memory, is going to have this kind of story, or whether you're thinking that the very notion of an item, like the way we think about a construct or a member or a kind, is going to undergo that kind of journey.
I hadn't fully thought that through yet. But for me, I was sort of connecting. For me, it was very helpful to connect the point of thinking about the way in which the lesson I take it from like the gene stuff is the way in which it's not that ontology takes a back seat, but ontology gets sort of relativized in ways that are fine for our purposes if you buy the kind of pluralistic moves. But that's sort of helpful for thinking like the role that looking for an ontology plays in the kind of inquiry, and pairing that with the kind of looking at that 2030 hypothetical abstract and thinking about what do we want, why are we asking for an ontology, what do we want our answer to look like, what are we using our ontology to answer? But I saw those things as sort of connected with thinking about like, well, if you think about like places where if it looks like there's going to be guiding assumptions and values behind every kind of inquiry we engage in, then let's look at places where we feel pretty certain that we have some kind of like reason for doing what we do, and let that be a kind of fuel for where does that get you? What kind of commitments in an ontology does that get you? I'm not sure if that directly hooks up or not, but
I was thinking about this point people have been making about there's kind of this placeholder for whatever it is that memory is. But I've been feeling something's missing, and I think I know what it is. You talked about it in terms of reactivating memory. And as long as you buy that, I think the placeholder works. There's another view in psychology is that no, reactivation isn't right. It's reconstruction.
yeah.
And things change all the time, and the memories are kind of reconstructed every time, and that's why they're kind of different and change. Not because of whatever the thing that corresponds to the placeholder for the memory that then gets reactivated is doing, but it's that the human is changing over the course of their life, and all kinds of things are playing into what that reconstruction is every time it's reconstructed.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. So I think that's yet another dimension of messing with this that I was sort of skipping here, because I think it's another feature that matters for whether or not some people think about reconsolidation as the mechanistic process of reconstruction, but that's a very limited idea about what reconstruction is, where it's sort of modifications to the trace rather than the lack of existence of that sort of thing. And it's unclear to me, especially with the move towards trying to add silent engrams to the ontology, whether for people like Tanegawa that see themselves as kind of natural descendants of the kind of engram theory of Zeman, where Zeman had the engram, but he also had the ekphery, and it was this idea that was the sort of, effectively it's the retrieval process, and you need both of them in order to do this, and it plays equally as important of a role, like retrieval isn't this neutral thing. Right, so if that's what reactivation means, then optogenetic reactivation is not that. And retrieval is its own thing, and it's going to matter how you track that over time. So that's another dimension of sort of articulating what those notions mean and how they vary. So yeah, I appreciate being reminded to think about that more. Yeah.
So there's a lot of interest in neuroscience these days in kind of using dynamical system sorts of approaches and saying, we're going to take retort. Like one of my favorite examples is this work from Saul Cato, where he took recorded from all 302 neurons in a C. elegans, and it shows that you can basically characterize the worm's movement using like 3 to top 3 dimensions with a PCA, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine, I don't know if people, I haven't seen that kind of approach taken in memory, but you can imagine that like the story could end up being something like, you know, the Engram is an attractor in a high dimensional state space, right? So, so if, let's say that we end up there, right?
Yeah.
So then, what is that ontologically?
Yeah,
What do you do with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So it looks to me like versions of debates that happen with, when Hebb comes along and tries to like give this idea about what the structured thing is going to be, and like sort of why it can't be these dynamic like that can't be the Engram, because it has to be something that's stable and it has to be distinctive such that, right, if there are overall changes to the system, I don't necessarily lose these things, or I'm not going to lose all of it, right? So it's got to be, certain things can't play that role, like certain ontologies aren't going to be the right ontology. But then what if we get more sophisticated versions of these and they start working, right? So then what do we do with that assumption? I think that's a great question for the models that do better and better at handling these very sophisticated kinds of cases. So that's, I think that's another way of pushing on what one of the assumptions is about why the structure, the physical structure, is what matters, and what's built into what that has to look like. And if we just sort of prove otherwise, then maybe we need to revise that concept.